What is the self, really? Do we truly possess something we can call ourself? Anyone who has studied philosophy has likely encountered the phrase, "know thyself." Carved into the ancient temple of Apollo at Delphi, this sentence has often been revered as the essence of philosophical wisdom. Yet for those deeply immersed in Western philosophy and committed to intense intellectual inquiry, such a phrase may appear oversimplified, more fitting for beginners than for seasoned thinkers. From the moment we first engage with philosophy, know thyself begins to root itself in our thoughts, almost like an incantation. It becomes embedded in our worldview, occupying a central and absolute position. We come to believe that the essence of studying philosophy lies in understanding ourselves. If the self doesn't exist, then philosophy too loses its purpose. In contemporary life, this phrase has evolved into a universal remedy, a psychological lifesaver, and a core value subtly influencing how we perceive meaning in our existence. It feels as though each person's journey through life must ultimately lead to the discovery of the self. But when we pause to question sincerely, what is the self? Do we truly have a self? These seemingly obvious ideas start to reveal their fragility. Are such beliefs truly sound when subjected to rigorous philosophical scrutiny? From a critical standpoint, to take the existence of the self for granted, without question, without examination, is to abandon reflection. This unexamined assumption forms the basis of much thought, and from it, we leap to the most profound philosophical questions of all. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? There's nothing wrong with the desire to know oneself, nor with the pursuit of these ultimate questions. But underlying all our inquiries into the self lies a deeper problem. How do we become aware of the self in the first place? What is the true nature of this I that we claim to know? These questions cut to the heart of what the self truly is. Once this perspective is grasped, perhaps you are now ready to carry the weight of self-inquiry. So let's return to the central question. What is yourself? Can you truly describe the self that you believe you understand? Take a moment to reflect. Pause and think carefully. If you possess genuine self-reflection, you'll likely begin to feel the contradiction inherent in the pursuit of the self. That contradiction lies in how our understanding of the self is always wrapped in layers of form and definition. Imagine, for example, being asked to describe yourself, or more specifically, to describe yourself. You will likely reach for adjectives and roles: beautiful, gentle, kind, intelligent. If asked who you are, you may answer with your name or your occupation. But what if you were asked to strip away all those external identifiers, to describe yourself without relying on anything attached to the outside? Suddenly the self appears hollow, empty in an absolute sense. And yet deep down, you still feel a powerful notion of self. This feeling, accompanied by vivid experiences and behaviors, presses hard against your consciousness. Like a shadow, it never leaves you. But as you try to examine it closely, to understand it truly, you find yourself adrift. Beyond mere sensations and labels, there is no clear picture. Every form we use to define the self is surrounded by imposed definitions and constraints, and beyond them, we're left with silence. And that is precisely where the deeper philosophical journey begins. The structure that shapes our understanding of ourselves permeates every aspect of society. We depend on external forms, roles, images, and identities to define who we are and what we want. Yet behind these countless forms, there is always a lingering void, a silent emptiness that watches from the background. Put simply, even though we cannot use pure rationality to fully grasp the I buried deep within us, that I continues to exist. It is always present, always questioning, always observing. This has nothing to do with whether you achieve self-actualization or not. As long as you exist, you are being watched by this inner self. You feel an unshakable sense of dissatisfaction, a restlessness, and so you begin to pursue an abstract ideal of who you think you should be. There is always a distance between your real, physical existence and the abstract image of yourself in your mind. That distance is the space between the pure emptiness of your essential being and the ever-accumulating layers of form and identity shaped by the outside world. So then, where does that leave the idea of the self? What is its direction? How can we seriously and systematically talk about what the self really is? The answer lies in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis offers a deeply insightful way to explore the structure of subjectivity. If you truly want to understand the self, this is a theoretical mountain you cannot walk around. You must climb it. In his theory of the mirror stage, Jacques Lacan proposed a powerful insight about the birth of self-consciousness. When an infant first sees its reflection in the mirror, it instinctively identifies that reflection as me. But this sense of me does not come from within. It arises from an external image. It is not the real self, but a projection, an illusion. This act of identifying with the image becomes the origin of self-awareness, but that awareness is based on a falsehood. Even before Lacan, Sigmund Freud laid the foundation of psychoanalysis by dividing the psyche into three layers: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the most primitive, unconscious part of the mind. It represents raw instinct, pure desire, and the chaotic drive for satisfaction. The ego is the rational bridge between the inner world and external reality. It works to mediate between the demands of the id and the expectations of the superego. The superego is the internalized moral ideal, the image of who we should be. It serves as a goal the ego tries to live up to, formed through social and cultural norms. Lacan adopted Freud's ideas, but also reinterpreted them through the lenses of linguistics, structuralism, and dialectics. He gave psychoanalysis a new philosophical depth. He introduced his famous three orders of subjectivity: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary is the realm of images, illusions, and false wholeness. It is where the subject first enters during the mirror stage. This is the space of ego formation, of identification with appearances. But this ego is never truly real. It masks the fact that the self is internally fragmented. Both the id and the ego belong primarily to the imaginary. The ego is a fantasy shaped in the mirror, and the id is expressed through unconscious desires. Desires born from a sense of lack within this illusory space. The symbolic, in contrast, is the world of language, law, and the big other, the overarching structure of society and culture. The symbolic is made up of symbols, rules, and meanings. It is the order that the individual enters through language and communication. It defines the social dimension of existence. Everything we present, express, or believe about ourselves is framed within the symbolic. The superego is born here. It takes root when we internalize cultural norms and moral structures and begin to judge ourselves by those standards. Together, these three realms show that the self is not a simple unified being waiting to be discovered. It is a construction, a fragile product of image, language, and unconscious desire. What we call the self is not something we own, but something that emerges between mirrors, words, and silences. And to truly understand ourselves, we must not merely ask, "Who am I?" but rather explore the structures that force us to ask such a question in the first place. The self, or subject, emerges within itself, but it is constrained and guided by prophecy, symbolic order, and social norms. These forces attempt to regulate the subject's behavior and grant it direction and motivation. However, despite their influence, such constraints can never fully fill the inherent void within the subject. The final and perhaps most elusive realm we must address is the real. The real represents a kind of raw truth that cannot be fully grasped, symbolized, or looked at directly. It lies beyond the imaginary and symbolic orders, a residue that resists integration into the systems of image or language. It is untouchable, unspeakable, and irreducibly foreign. The real is the blind spot of the subject's desire, the emptiness outside the realm of structure and meaning. Once psychoanalysis enters the discussion, we gain clarity on a profound claim. The human being does not truly possess a self. Human subjectivity, according to psychoanalysis, is fundamentally void. So what then was Lacan's radical transformation of Freud's theories? Why does psychoanalysis regard the subject as inherently empty? From Lacan's perspective, the id, or what Freud called the it, has its source in the real. The id seeks to compensate for a lack, a void, which is precisely the rupture introduced by the real. Meanwhile, the ego and superego are formed as responses to this fear and emptiness, shaped by the imaginary and symbolic realms. In Freud's model, the id was the most primitive layer of the psyche, unconscious, formless, and driven by blind instinct. It was beyond awareness and acted without reason or purpose. But Lacan redefined the id by emphasizing its relationship with language and symbolic systems. He deepened its connection to the unconscious and reshaped our understanding entirely. For Lacan, the unconscious does not operate outside structure. It operates through it. The unconscious functions in the form of language, through symbols. The desires expressed by the id are not merely biological instincts. Rather, they are constructed through the symbolic system. He rejected Freud's conflation of instinct and desire, arguing instead that desire arises in response to a fundamental lack, a rupture in the subject's being caused by entry into the symbolic. So why is the id described as void-like? Because it is not a solid or positive presence. It is an expression of absence. The id is a hole, a blank core at the heart of the subject that is continually stirred by desire but never satisfied. Lacan's reframing thus elevates the id from being a simple engine of impulse to something far more structural, a crack in the subject that can never be sealed. To understand this, think of the id as an empty container. It has no features, no substance. Its defining characteristic is absence, and no matter what you try to pour into it, you can never fill it completely. There will always be something left over, a residue that remains unfixed. That residue is the unspeakable gap in the subject's psyche, the fracture that no simple explanation can patch over. So what is it that we're constantly trying to pour into this empty container? The answer is the ego. In classical Freudian psychoanalysis, the ego stands between the id and the superego, mediating their conflict under the principle of reality. It is the negotiator, shaped by experience and driven by reason. But Lacan offered a far more critical interpretation. The ego does not emerge suddenly or innately. Rather, it is generated through our interactions with external objects. This is why the mirror stage is so crucial in Lacanian theory. It marks the birth of the ego. According to Lacan's mirror stage theory, the ego is constructed through identification in the imaginary realm. The infant sees an external image, often its reflection in the mirror, and mistakes it for a complete and coherent self. That identification becomes the foundation for the ego. But the image is always external, always illusory. Thus, the ego is born not from an internal truth but from a misrecognition. This insight reveals a deeper truth. The ego is not our true self. It is a facade, a fiction pieced together through images, external reflections, and social expectations. And because it tries to fill the empty container of the id, but can never succeed, it too becomes trapped in the cycle of lack and desire. In this framework, what we typically call the self is not a unified, authentic being, but a fragile structure assembled from illusions, language, and unfulfilled longing. To understand the self is not to find a hidden essence, but to trace the edges of the void that lies at its center. The emergence of the self requires two foundational conditions. First, the presence of a subjective container, what we call the id, and second, the subject's entry into the imaginary realm, where objectification and identification occur. The id, existing in a state of total lack, seeks something outside itself to identify with. When an infant sees its reflection in a mirror for the first time, it experiences a powerful illusion that its internal sense of incompleteness has suddenly been made whole. This perceived wholeness is then internalized and becomes what we call the self. But in truth, this self is born of misrecognition. It does not align with the fragmented, divided reality of the subject. This is what Lacan describes as the fantasized nature of the ego. Lacan defines the ego as an imaginative illusion, something that exists solely to cover over the subject's inner void. The subject mistakenly believes itself to be whole, but it is, in fact, always split by a fundamental rupture in the symbolic order. And this split is something the superego attempts, futilely, to compensate for. In Freud's theory, the superego is the embodiment of morality and societal rules, representing the internalized voices of parents and cultural authorities. Lacan extends this idea, placing the superego firmly within the symbolic order and reinterpreting it as the internal expression of the big other. The big other is the authoritative system of symbols, language, and social norms. The superego then becomes the spokesperson of this symbolic system, projecting moral commands and ideals onto the ego. Importantly, Lacan notes that the superego is not just a restraining force, it also contains an imperative to enjoy. The superego demands that the subject conform to social norms, but this demand paradoxically deepens the subject's suffering. No matter how hard the subject tries, it can never fully satisfy the expectations of the big other. Through the lens of Lacan's three orders, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, this loop is complete. Subjectivity is shown to be grounded in emptiness. From the very beginning, subjectivity is built upon a foundational lack. No matter how much we attempt to fill this lack, a rift remains between the subject and what it seeks. In the early stages of development, the subject enters the symbolic via the mirror stage, forming a self-image. But this self-image is a false promise of wholeness. Afterward, the subject steps into the realm of symbols and language, which try to cover the void. Still, these structures never fully encompass the subject's experience. In the face of the real, something that cannot be symbolized, the subject is always split. When the concepts of id, ego, and superego are fully integrated with Lacan's three orders, a recurring cycle emerges. At the center of it lies a truth: the I originates in lack, and every time the subject tries to fill that lack, it only creates a larger void. The subject endlessly returns to itself, trying to bridge the distance between the constructed ego and the abstract, unreachable self. But this process can never be completed. There will always be a remainder, an irreconcilable gap between the I that acts and the I that is longed for. This explains why no matter how much effort you pour into self-realization, no matter how many goals you achieve, you are always left with a lingering emptiness, a gnawing question that returns to confront you. At this point, you might ask, if I'm constructed from lack and I will ultimately return to that lack, why is it like this? The answer lies in desire. Desire is the pure driving force of subjectivity, rotating constantly between the id, ego, and superego. The subject is always driven by desire, but desire, by its very nature, is an unfulfillable pursuit. It is constructed within the symbolic order and must always be oriented towards something external. Desire comes from the other. The subject's desire is always the desire of the other. There is no such thing as a purely personal, isolated desire. All desire is shaped by external structures and always points toward an unattainable goal. As previously mentioned, the real represents that which cannot be symbolized, the pure, ungraspable truth. The subject tries to approach the real through language, culture, and imagination, but the real always remains defined by absence. Its inaccessibility intensifies the subject's sense of void, for the subject's existence is, at its core, a failed attempt to encounter the real. The void within the subject, combined with the erosive force of the real, leads to a condition in which the human being is driven forward solely by desire. We try endlessly to bridge the gap between the self and the world, using desire as the vehicle. From everything we've explored so far, the conclusion becomes clear. Both the origin of the self and the quest to understand it are grounded in nothingness. And this fundamental void eventually gives rise to a sense of meaninglessness. So should we simply accept this meaninglessness? If we still insist on finding the self, on achieving some form of self-realization, how should we proceed? The answer is both simple and clear. Follow your desire. We must understand a core truth. Your desire is everything. It is born from the subject's essential lack and serves as the driving mechanism behind your entire existence. Where your desire points is where your self begins to emerge. Every unexamined motivation you have, every urge towards self-realization or idealization, is nothing more than the expression of desire seeking fulfillment. Everything else shifts, everything is unstable, everything trends toward emptiness. Only desire remains real and unchanging. Desire completes you. Therefore, to follow your desire is to become yourself. Your subjectivity is constructed through and by desire. And this leads us to one final liberating realization. The self you are searching for, the ideal, fully realized self, does not exist. The you that truly moves, acts, and becomes is grounded in the force of desire. You are the becoming that desire shapes.